Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Ben, this is Books with Benghis Khan, and today I have for you my January reading wrap-up. And it was one of the strangest reading months of my life, especially because I was just so busy with work and kind of moving into a new role at my company, and was really just working two jobs for a while, and so tired out. That's why I haven't made any videos the last couple weeks, but I only had energy for just a lot of audio and did so much of that, and I think contributed to the weirdness that my reading month took on. But let's get to the books. So I started out the month finishing up book 5 of Dungeon Crawler Carl. That's The Butcher's Masquerade. And even if I was just talking about the last chunk of the book, it was so incredible. It's one of the most spectacular climactic sequences I've ever read. And by this time, with these last couple Dungeon Crawler Carl books that have been released, it's turning into something truly epic. I spent so much time with the characters at this point. I've become so attached, and I have been loving how just grand scale, just crazy things that are happening in these last few books. I mean, there's really tense things happening throughout the series, but I think Dinneman's really leveled up with these last couple books, and I think is taking the series to a truly special place. So, finishing up this scene at the Butcher's Masquerade, the book's titled it, so it's not giving too much away that there's this big masquerade that everything's leading toward, and he pulls off this Ocean's 11 style kind of narrative structure where we're not initially in on all the big plans that the characters are kind of putting into place for the event, but as the day starts, we kind of get flashbacks into the planning process, and then we see that part of the plan try to play out. And I loved this in Ocean's 11, and I loved it here in this book. And then the pacing of this section is incredible, with a lot of slower paced, really emotionally poignant scenes mixed in to the action and craziness. And man, just an amazing ending and an easy 5-star read for me. Then I went right into book 6 of Dungeon Crawler Carl. That's The Eye of the Bedlam Bride. And this did something way different with the kind of game mechanics and level design. I will maybe want to talk about this in a spoiler chat video about the series, so I don't want to even give it away what kind of change was made for this level, but it felt really fresh for me. It was really interesting, and there were a few sequences throughout this book that took my breath away with how emotionally tense they were. And Dinneman is amazing with action scenes that are not just interesting action, but that bring in really important character moments and plot twists for the overarching story and world building elements, and just so many interesting things are going on in these major, huge sequences. And there's a few of them in this book that are incredible. So this book also 5 stars, and had maybe some elements in there in the middle where I lost my engagement a tiny bit. So none of these books in the series have been just kind of perfect reads for me, but they've been so nearly so that I forgive them for little moments of, losing my engagement along the way, because I am so attached to the main POV protagonist, but more so than almost any other series I can remember, growing attached to the side characters and really kind of minor side characters as well. Dinneman's brought them to life, and I've done it all on audio, and Jeff Hayes' audio is one of my favorites. I wish I had listened to him in time for my favorite audiobook narrators list, because he'd probably be in the top 5, and just delivering so much performance with all these different characters. And the humor, I'd say most of the series, it feels very gritty and very emotionally intense, but the humor that is just spread throughout is lightening things up a little bit, and Hayes is so great with that, and the humor really hits for me personally, so that has been just making these listens a delight. So there I was, early January, just spent 3 weeks alone with Dungeon Crawler Carl and nothing else. It was just had completely taken over my life, and I wanted the next book to be available so badly and just continue on, because it's going to be this explosive, just series-defining book. I think it's probably going to be a lot like Changes is for the Dresden Files, this kind of fulcrum point around which everything in the series will turn. And man, I just was feeling like so just in need of spending more time with those characters in that world. And then I was picking up for a buddy read a new epic fantasy series. I was planning to start 5 Warrior Angels by Brian Lee Durfee. And I started that, and I was just trying to get into it, this new secondary world. Just, man, there's such a barrier to entry with epic fantasy, with a new series and a new author that you never spent time in terms of just the mental energy it feels like it takes to get used to just a new place and characters and the conflicts, and there's so much really involved in getting into that. And so, man, it's so much easier being in real world set literary fiction, or even sci-fi, or urban fantasy like Dungeon Crawler Carl. There's not as much barrier to entry with all new kind of world building to learn. And so, man, I just did not feel up to it to start 5 Warrior Angels, and I was just missing Dungeon Crawler Carl so much. So I was like, you know what? I'm not going to force it. This is not the time. I want to really just, when I'm ready to pick up this other series, give it its best chance to be a hit with me. And so I was just like, you know what? I'll do the silliest thing I've ever done in my reading life, and I'll just start a reread of Dungeon Crawler Carl series. So I started back at book 1. That's Dungeon Crawler Carl. I had just finished it about 3 weeks before, but I was so happy to be back in from the start, and it was the right choice because it was just my comfort zone at a very busy time in my life too. And so I was able to not have to devote my full attention to it all the time, although I ended up pretty much doing that because it was just so engaging, and I was catching just little bits of foreshadowing and picking up on humor that I didn't land because I needed extra context, or even just seeing seeds being laid down in the very first book for later character relationships or plot conflicts or world building things, or just the skills and spells that Carl and Donut are learning on early on in book 1 that later become so much more powerful and important. And seeing them kind of establish all that in book 1 was a lot of fun. But a reread, you do just have less pressure to be catching everything, and you don't have to be paying as much attention. So it was perfect for just the mood I was in needing something a little less energy intense. And so I was rereading that, and then ended up, I think, loving book 1 even more than the first time. Went right on into book 2, which for me is easily the weakest of the series. But it's short, it's doing something very different, but kind of takes you on some side quests that don't really feel that engaging on their own, and that's what a lot of the book is. But it's pretty easy to get through that second book pretty quickly, and on to book 3, where I think the series really finds its sea legs and becomes really what it will be. And kind of in a similar way that the Dresden Files takes a long time to really get going, and people do tend to like book 1, Stormfront, a bit, and then feel like there's a step down in book 2 with Full Moon. It's like, oh, I guess I know what this series is kind of going to be. But gradually it ramps up into something epic with getting the readers so attached to the characters, and that's what Dungeon Crawler Carl does, and I think even faster than the Dresden Files, because by the time book 3, book 4 comes around, I was feeling extremely attached, and my re-listens were just so fun. And so I have actually re-listened to the whole series. I'm almost done with it again. So I've done the whole Dungeon Crawler Carl series of 6 books, basically twice within a 2-month period. And some of those later books are pretty long too. But Hayes is such an engaging narrator. It was just, I never even found myself wanting to skip over parts, even if they were pretty fresh in my memory. But I don't have a perfect memory for little details, and so still a lot of things would feel fresh all over again, even if I had just listened to them 3 weeks ago. So I listened to book 3, book 4, book 5, and now I'm almost done with book 6 again. I'm in the climactic section of The Eye of the Bedlam Bride, which is just also one of the most thrilling parts of any series I've ever been in. It's amazing how I'm still feeling the same kind of tension as I did the first time around. Now, while I was listening to Dungeon Crawler Carl, I did pick up some things in print. And I did yet another reread, but this one of something I'd read 5 years ago. And this is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. I got to use my beautiful kind of Dragonsteel edition. And yeah, when you read a whole book from here, the design will smudge off a little bit, but that's okay. I want to use my special editions that I get and not just let them look pretty on the shelf. This one has some incredible art inside. And so yeah, I was very happy to read from this one and re-experience the book, because I had liked it the first time, but I think I liked it even more this time around. Definitely one of my favorite Cosmere novels, and it's a weird one because not a lot happens. It's probably the least action heavy of all the Cosmere books, and it's just a lot of politicking, people having quiet conversations with each other, but there's a lot of kind of overall tension because there's this kind of war that's building between these two factions, and we as the reader don't really want it to happen. We like people on both sides. There's people in the plot who seem to want it to happen, and then others who are trying to stop it. And the end of this book actually brought me to tears a little bit. It got me emotional, and I rarely feel that emotional. And so, man, when a book does that, it has touched me deeply and is becoming something that is really just gonna stay with me and be so memorable for so many years. I did remember kind of some of the things that were gonna happen, but then when I experienced them all over again, they were just beautiful. And so just a great Cosmere book, and I want the Nightblood sequel so badly. I hope we get that eventually, and I will be able to die a happy man. So, yeah, great reread. Love that. Thank you, read by Kyle and Laura at Fantasy at Wash, for encouraging that. Then it was time to pick back up with The Realm of the Elderlings, and I read City of Dragons by Robin Hobb. That's book 3 of the Rainwild Chronicles. So I am definitely an outlier with this series in how much I loved books 1 and 2, Dragon Keeper and Dragon Haven, of this sub-series. And that exact plot of those two books really was just captivating to me and ended in a really beautiful way. And I had no clue where this was going to go, and I kind of almost didn't need to continue on, that it wrapped up so perfectly where it was. But this picked back up where we left off. In classic Hobb fashion, everything gets even more complicated for our cast of characters, and it's setting up, I think, some really interesting things, but this is basically like a series reset and feels a lot like a book 1, and just characters getting into place for kind of what's to come later and dealing with a lot of internal character conflicts still. And I don't know, I think I was just ready to move past this phase a little bit of this sub-series, and I felt like I was kind of reliving some of the kind of inner character kind of conflicts that I had hoped kind of had already gotten worked through in the previous books. So this one did not work as well for me, but still a very involving Hobb book, and I don't think there's anything she could do with Realm of the Elderlings that I wouldn't really be engaged with and not like. But I definitely didn't find myself as engaged and gripped as I was with the first 2 books of this sub-series, but definitely excited with where it's going, because Hobb is usually spectacular with finales and climactic sequences. So I think this is all going to be very necessary for setting that up. But on its own, probably my least favorite book of the series. With listening to the Dungeon Crawler Carl books all over again, I needed another thing that I just wanted to do in print, and I had this book lying around for years, Exhalation by Ted Chiang, and I read the first maybe 5 stories. I'm a little bit more than halfway through, but man, some of these stories were amazing. The Merchant and the Alchemist Gate to start was such an entrancing, interesting like fable of a story, a great vibe to it. And then Exhalation too is just, man, Ted Chiang does these really unique thought experiments that have these very particular vibes that just I have not felt really with any other thing that I've ever read. And then the novella was my favorite so far. That's The Life Cycle of Software Objects. That felt more like a very kind of earth-set, modern kind of story. And it's about these kind of digital animals that these people at this company are raising in a kind of metaverse type of situation. And I was so engaged. I just read this over the course of one day, and it was just, I wanted it to go on longer. I wish it was, I just wanted more. I could have done a whole novel of this story and these characters. They were so interesting. And all these stories, including that one, I think have won multiple awards, very deservedly so. I don't read too many short stories, but Ted Chiang is an absolute master of the form, and I am still excited to read the last few stories in this collection. And then I reached for a book that I was excited to in order to finish out a series, although I'm not sure if Tchaikovsky might be actually continuing, and I've heard he might be writing another one in this Children of Time series. This is Children of Memory, Book 3, and I'm nearly done. And it's doing something very interesting. This is not a series where it's just like one contiguous story just split up into different volumes of books, because they all have very different narrative styles and approaches. Book 1 was just so straightforward and happening in one present timeline, just switching back and forth between two groups. Then Book 2 introduced a flashback structure as Children of Ruin, and it was still kind of really easy to follow along. But this book is easily the most kind of ideas-dense, theme-driven, like abstract kind of work I've ever read by Tchaikovsky. It requires me to slow down and think about what's going on and go back and reread parts. And I don't necessarily love doing that. I just more prefer, usually, especially if I'm more tired out, to be just immersed in a kind of gripping read that's kind of easier to follow along and just kind of go on a roller coaster ride through, like Children of Time was. So this book is doing something very different, and it has had parts that have been really awesome, and it's continuing along the excellent theme work of this series. But a little harder to just figure out what's going on, and it's more fragmented in the way it's being told in the flashback structure, and kind of more feeling like an abstract sci-fi poem at times, more than a straightforward kind of narrative like Children of Time was. So I understand why a lot of fans of that one don't love this one. I'm still liking it, just hasn't been as gripping, but some of the aspects that I don't want to even talk about have been a lot of fun. So another solid Tchaikovsky book, but I probably do prefer Children of Time and Children of Ruin to this one. When I get a chance to be driving places with my mom, we've been listening to audiobooks, and I might go on a bit of a road trip with her tomorrow to visit some used bookstores that are a little farther afield than usual, because my wife is back home visiting family, so just can go on some long drives with my mom, and who's enjoying listening to Project Hail Mary. This is one of my favorite standalone books, one of my favorite sci-fis, and I listened to it the first time, but it's been a few years, and I've been really enjoying listening to that one. So that's something I am going to be listening to for a little while longer. I got to finish up Children of Memory, and then as far as what else I'll be reading in February, I have Blood of Dragons that I mentioned, being excited about, the finale of the Rainwild Chronicles, and I should be starting very soon, when I'm done with Children of Memory, A Song for Our Bone, my first Guy Gavriel K book. So that's going to be a buddy read with Talking Story and Chris Navo. I think they already started, so I got to catch up. I'm so pumped to get into this new author. And I think I'm ready to, now that I've done a full kind of 2 listens through of the Dungeon Crawler Carl series, I think I've purged that from my system. I think I'm ready to move on and get into a completely new author and new world. And I think GGK, sets these kind of almost like historical fantasy, so probably not too much kind of secondary world building that I'll have to get into. But excited to see what's going on with that. All right, now for my book of the month. This is actually a really hard choice between Dungeon Crawler Carl's book 5 and 6, because I really love these just about equally. I think I'm going to go with The Butcher's Masquerade, because of the action kind of throughout that book was really compelling, and the character moments we got started to be just kind of a huge step up even from what we've been getting before. And the ending sequence, one of my favorites. There's very little that I have to complain about with that book. It is a really stellar book, and if you're on the fence or not sure, just try out book 1, Dungeon Crawler Carl. It'll give you a sense for what the rest are going to be like. But if you're still not sure after book 2, I'd say just keep going. They're pretty short. So once you get into books 4, 5, 6, man, it becomes something grandly epic and really emotionally poignant. So stick it out and try it out if you're not sure. I was a huge skeptic before, having never done any lit RPG, and thought it was just going to be something light, more frivolous, but it's a very gritty and dark, so be prepared for that. So yeah, that was my very weird January, and let me know what you've enjoyed from the past month, And if you've read any of these things that I've talked about or that we'll be reading, I know a lot of people have been loving Song for Our Bone in recent months. Let me know what you're excited for me to try soon, and I'll catch you later.